He thought it was just a vacation until the alien bride locked the room from the inside. The diplomatic arrangement Captain Darian Vale adjusted his formal uniform one last time. As the transport shuttle descended toward the crystalline moon of Kepler through the viewport, he watched the ice-covered surface shimmer like diamonds under the binary stars. After 15 years of brutal interstellar warfare, this marriage was supposed to symbolize peace between Earth and the Thalquari Empire. What it really felt like was another military assignment. "Final approach, Captain," announced Lieutenant Torres from the pilot's seat. "The palace coordinates are locked in." Darian nodded, his mind drifting to the briefing files he'd memorized. Princess Zerilyn of the Fifth House, daughter of High Regent Murthik. Telepathic abilities ranging from Class 7 to 9, depending on emotional state. The photographs showed an ethereal woman with luminescent blue skin and silver markings that traced elegant patterns across her features. Beautiful, certainly, but alien in ways that made his stomach tighten with uncertainty. The marriage had been negotiated at the highest levels. Earth needed the Thalquari's advanced shielding technology, and the Thalquari required access to Earth's mineral-rich asteroid belts. A political union between their species would cement the treaty and end decades of bloodshed. Darian had volunteered, not out of romantic inclination, but from duty. Too many of his friends had died in the war for him to refuse when his government asked. "There it is," Torres breathed as the palace came into view. Carved directly into a mountain of living crystal, the structure seemed to grow from the ice itself. Spires twisted skyward like frozen lightning, and warm golden light emanated from within, creating a beacon against the stark landscape. It was beautiful enough to take his breath away, yet alien enough to remind him how far from home he truly was. The shuttle settled onto a landing platform with barely a whisper. As the engines powered down, Darian gathered his personal belongings, a small duffel bag containing everything he owned that mattered. The rest of his life on Earth felt like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else. A figure emerged from the palace entrance, moving with fluid grace across the ice. Princess Zerilyn wore robes of deep crimson that flowed around her like liquid fire, a stark contrast to her azure skin. Her silver hair caught the starlight as she approached, and even from a distance, Darian could see the intricate tattoos that marked her royal lineage spiraling up her arms and neck. "Showtime," he muttered, then stepped out into the thin, cold atmosphere. Their first meeting was formal, conducted in basic standard with careful diplomatic courtesy. Zerilyn's voice carried musical undertones that no human throat could produce, and her eyes, large and multifaceted like cut gems, seemed to look through him rather than at him. "Captain Vale," she said, inclining her head in what he recognized as a traditional Thalquari greeting. "You honor our house with your presence. The honor is mine." "Your Highness," he replied, offering his own respectful bow. They were led through corridors of breathtaking beauty, where bioluminescent crystals provided gentle illumination, and the walls themselves seemed alive with shifting patterns of light. Servants moved silently through the hall's other Thalquari with skin tones ranging from pale green to deep purple, all bearing the graceful bearing of their species. The ceremony was brief but profound. Ancient words in the Thalquari language resonated through the crystal chambers, and Darian felt something shift in the air around them as they spoke their vows. When Zerilyn placed her hand in his, he felt a strange tingling sensation, as if electricity were passing between them. Afterward, she led him to their quarters, a magnificent suite, carved from a single enormous giada, its walls lined with amethyst formations that cast everything in soft purple light. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the frozen landscape beyond. "This is beautiful," Darian said, genuinely impressed despite himself. Zerilyn turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw something beyond diplomatic politeness in her expression. Something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps hunger. "Captain Vale," she said softly, "there are things about this union that were not included in your briefing materials." Before he could ask what she meant, he heard the subtle sound of the door sealing behind them with a finality that made his blood run cold. The locked chamber's soft chime of the door mechanism engaging was almost musical, but the implications hit Darian like a physical blow. He spun around, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation. The entrance they'd just passed through now showed no visible seam in the crystal wall, as if it had never existed at all. "Princess," he said carefully, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "What's happening here?" Zerilyn moved to the center of the room with that same fluid grace, her crimson robes pooling around her feet like spilled wine. When she turned to face him, her multifaceted eyes held depths he couldn't fathom. "My name is Zerilyn, not Princess, and what's happening, Darian Vale, is what was always meant to happen." Her voice carried new harmonics now, undertones that seemed to resonate in his chest. The diplomatic marriage was merely the framework. The true bonding begins now. Darian's hand instinctively moved toward where his sidearm would normally rest, finding only empty air. Of course he'd been required to come unarmed as a gesture of trust. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. The treaty specifies what your people needed to hear," Zerilyn interrupted, stepping closer. "But the Thalquari have our own requirements for this union, our own needs." The room's amethyst walls began to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, and Darian realized with growing unease that the princess was somehow connected to the living crystal around them. Every gesture she made sent ripples of light through the walls, as if the entire chamber were an extension of her consciousness. "Let me be clear," he said, drawing on his command experience. "To project authority, I agreed to a diplomatic marriage, not to be held prisoner. Open that door." Now, something flickered across Zerilyn's features, surprise, perhaps, or amusement. "Prisoner? Is that what you think this is?" She gestured toward the luxurious surroundings, the comfortable seating, areas carved from single pieces of jade-colored crystal, the automated food dispensers, the sleeping alcove lined with what looked like the softest materials in the galaxy. "Does this seem like a prison to you?" "Any place you can't leave is a prison," Darian replied. Regardless of how comfortable it might be. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the room. Then Zerilyn did something unexpected. She laughed. The sound was like crystal chimes in a gentle breeze, beautiful and alien at the same time. "You humans are so linear in your thinking," she said. "You see only the surface of things. Yes, the door is sealed. Yes, our communication with the outside is blocked. But this isn't about imprisonment, Darian. This is about necessity." She moved to the great window overlooking the frozen landscape, her reflection ghost-like in the crystal. "Do you know anything about Thalquari bonding practices?" The briefing mentioned that your marriages involve some form of telepathic connection, Darian said cautiously. "Bonding," she corrected, "not marriage as your people understand it. When a Thalquari bonds with another being, we don't simply share a legal contract or even physical intimacy. We share consciousness itself. Thoughts, emotions, memories, everything becomes connected." Darian felt his mouth go dry. That wasn't in the treaty negotiations, because your diplomats would never have agreed to it. They think in terms of trade agreements and military alliances. They don't understand that some connections transcend politics. Zerilyn turned back to face him, and now he could see something almost vulnerable in her expression. "The truth is, Darian, I didn't choose you. Fate did." "What does that mean?" "It means that 3 months ago, during our initial diplomatic contacts, something unprecedented happened. When your image was transmitted to our court during the preliminary meetings, I felt you across the vastness of space. Through barriers that should have made such connection impossible, I sensed your presence." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "In 1,500 years of Thalquari history, such instant recognition has happened only 12 times. It always indicates a bond pairing of extraordinary strength." Darian sank into one of the crystal chairs, his mind reeling. "You're saying we're, what, soulmates?" "I'm saying that the universe itself has marked us as compatible at the deepest possible level. The diplomatic marriage was simply the excuse to bring us together. But the real union, the bonding that requires time, privacy, and complete honesty. Between us, the implications were staggering." "How long?" "As long as it takes," Zerilyn said simply. "Days, weeks, perhaps months. The process cannot be rushed, and it cannot be interrupted. That's why the isolation is necessary." Darian looked around their crystal prison with new eyes, seeing it now as both sanctuary and trap. Outside, the frozen moon continued its eternal dance around the gas giant it orbited, but inside this chamber, time seemed to have a different meaning entirely. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Zerilyn's expression grew sad. "Then we both suffer the consequences of an incomplete bond for the rest of our lives. The connection exists whether we acknowledge it or not, Darian. The only choice is whether we embrace it or fight it." As if to emphasize her point, the crystal walls pulsed again, and this time Darian swore he could feel an echo of something not quite his own emotions stirring in his chest. Walls coming down. 3 days had passed since the door sealed, and Darian was beginning to understand the true meaning of psychological warfare. Not that Zerilyn was deliberately trying to break him, quite the opposite. She seemed genuinely concerned for his comfort, ensuring he had everything he needed, maintaining respectful distance when he needed space to think. It was the very reasonableness of it all that was driving him slowly insane. The food dispenser provided meals that were not only nutritionally perfect for human physiology, but also tailored to his personal preferences in ways that should have been impossible. When he'd commented on it, Zerilyn had simply said, "The bond shares more than you realize." Even in its early stages, that was the thing that unsettled him most, the growing awareness that something was indeed happening between them, something beyond normal human experience. He'd catch himself knowing things he shouldn't know, like the fact that Zerilyn had been nervous about their first meeting, or that she had a fondness for a particular type of crystalline flower that grew only in the deep caves of her homeworld. "You're fighting it," she observed on the third evening as they shared what had become their routine dinner together. They sat across from each other at a table that had somehow grown from the floor, when they needed it, another casual display of the living architecture surrounding them. "Of course I'm fighting it," Darian replied, setting down his fork with more force than necessary. "This isn't how things work where I come from. We believe in choice, in free will. What you're describing sounds like mental invasion." Zerilyn's expression grew thoughtful, her silver hair catching the bioluminescent glow from the walls. "May I show you something?" Before he could answer, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The moment their skin made contact, the world exploded into sensation. Suddenly, Darian was experiencing the war from an entirely different perspective. He saw human ships through Thalquari eyes, felt the terror of civilians as their cities were bombarded, experienced the grief of mothers who would never see their children again. But more than that, he felt Zerilyn's own personal losses: a brother killed in the Proxima Centauri engagement, friends who died when Earth forces struck a diplomatic convoy that they claimed contained weapons. Then, just as abruptly, the connection shifted. Now Zerilyn was experiencing his memories. She felt the weight of command, the impossible decisions he'd been forced to make, the nights he'd lain awake wondering if the lives lost under his command could ever be justified. She experienced his own losses, his own grief, his own desperate hope that someday the killing would end. When the connection broke, they were both breathing hard, tears streaming down their faces. "Do you see?" Zerilyn whispered. "This isn't invasion, Darian. This is understanding. This is what the universe is offering us, the chance to truly know each other, to bridge the gap between our species, not through treaties and trade agreements, but through genuine connection." Darian wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, struggling to process what he'd just experienced. "That was intense. That was only the beginning," she said softly. "A true bond would allow us to share not just memories, but consciousness itself. We would still be individuals, but we would also be more." For the first time since arriving on the crystalline moon, Darian found himself genuinely curious rather than merely afraid. What would that mean, practically speaking? Zerilyn rose from her chair and moved to the great window. Outside, aurora-like lights danced across the frozen landscape, colors that had no names in any human language. It would mean never being alone again, she said. It would mean having someone who understands you completely, who shares your burdens and your joys. It would mean that when decisions must be made that affect both our peoples, we would make them together with full understanding of how they would impact everyone involved. She turned back to face him, and in her multifaceted eyes, he saw not the alien princess who had trapped him here, but a person who was just as scared and uncertain as he was. But it would also mean sacrifice, she continued. Privacy as you understand it would be impossible. Your thoughts, your feelings, your deepest secrets, they would all be known to me, as mine would be to you. Some humans find that prospect terrifying. Darian joined her at the window, standing close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Some humans, he said quietly, have been alone for so long that the idea of genuine connection sounds like a gift, rather than a curse. The admission surprised him. Where had that come from? But even as he wondered, he realized it was true. The years of war, the burden of command, the weight of decisions that had cost thousands of lives, it had all left him more isolated than he'd ever admitted to himself. The bond isn't forced, Zerilyn said gently. It can only form between willing participants. But once begun, it cannot be undone. That's why the isolation period is necessary, to ensure that both parties truly understand what they're choosing. Darian looked out at the dancing lights in the alien sky, thinking about everything he'd learned in the past 3 days. The war was over, but the peace was fragile. His marriage to Zerilyn was supposed to be a symbol, but maybe it could be something more. Maybe it could be the foundation for a new kind of understanding between their species. How long do we have to decide? He asked. As long as you need, Zerilyn replied. But Darian, there's something else you should know. She placed her hand on the crystal wall, and suddenly the chamber filled with images, not memories this time, but visions of possible futures. He saw himself and Zerilyn working together, bridging the gap between Earth and the Thalquari Empire, their bond serving as a living example of what cooperation could achieve. He saw colonies where humans and Thalquari lived side by side, sharing knowledge and culture. He saw children, hybrid offspring who carried the best of both species. But he also saw darker possibilities, the bond rejected, the marriage remaining purely symbolic, old prejudices resurging, and eventually war beginning again. The choice isn't just about us, Zerilyn whispered. It's about the future of both our peoples. As the visions faded, Darian realized that his perspective on their situation had fundamentally shifted. This wasn't imprisonment, it was opportunity. The question was whether he was brave enough to take it. The deepening connection be the 7th day. The walls between them had begun to crumble in ways that had nothing to do with telepathy. They had established routines that felt surprisingly natural. Morning meals where they discussed their respective cultures, afternoon periods where they pursued individual interests within the shared space, and evenings spent in conversation that ranged from the philosophical to the mundane. Darian had discovered that Zerilyn had a passion for ancient Earth literature, particularly poetry from the Romantic period. She would recite Keats and Shelley in her musical voice, the alien harmonics adding new dimensions to familiar words. In return, he shared stories from his military service, not the battles and strategies, but the moments of humanity that had sustained him through the darkness. A young lieutenant who painted watercolors of every planet they visited, a gruff sergeant who wrote letters to his daughter every night, the way soldiers would share photos of home during long watches. You speak of your military family with great affection, Zerilyn observed as they walked through what she called the memory gardens, a section of their chamber where crystalline formations recorded and displayed significant moments from Thalquari history. They were my family, Darian replied, pausing before a crystal that showed ancient Thalquari warriors in ceremonial armor. My parents died when I was young. The military gave me purpose, belonging, a way to channel my anger into something productive. Anger. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the recorded warriors move through their ritual dance. At the universe, I suppose, for taking away everyone I cared about, for making me fight a war I never wanted to fight, for putting me in situations where good people died because of my decisions. Zerilyn's hand found his, and he felt that now familiar tingle of connection. But this time, instead of sharing memories, she simply offered comfort, a warm presence that seemed to ease the old pain he carried. The first time I killed someone in battle, she said softly, I was 19 standard years old, a human raider who had invaded one of our outer colonies. I could have stunned him, taken him prisoner, but I was afraid and angry, and she shrugged, a gesture that seemed oddly human. I used full force. He died instantly. I'm sorry, Darian said, and meant it. For 3 months afterward, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face, wondering about his family, his dreams. What had driven him to become a raider in the first place? My father said it would pass. That battle grief always does, but it never really did. It just integrated into who I am. They continued walking, their hands still joined, both lost in their own memories of a war that had shaped them in ways they were only now beginning to understand. The bond would share that burden, Zerilyn said eventually, the guilt, the pain, the memories that wake you in the middle of the night, not to erase them, but to carry them together. Is that what you want? Darian asked. To carry my darkness, along with your own. She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the soft light of the memory gardens, her blue skin seemed to glow with its own luminescence, and the silver markings on her face shifted in patterns he was beginning to recognize as expressions of deep emotion. I want to know you, she said. Simply, all of you, the darkness and the light, the strength and the vulnerability, the man who commands fleets and the man who grieves for his fallen soldiers. That's what the bond offers, complete acceptance. That evening, they shared their deepest fears. Darian spoke of his terror of being alone, of the way command had isolated him from genuine human connection, of his worry that he was fundamentally broken by war. Zerilyn revealed her own anxieties about being worthy of her royal heritage, her fear that the bond would somehow diminish her individuality, her concern that she was being selfish by wanting something beyond duty for the first time in her life. What if we're wrong about this? Darian asked as they sat together watching the aurora dance outside their window. What if the bond doesn't work the way it's supposed to? What if we end up hating each other? Then we'll hate each other with perfect understanding, Zerilyn replied with a small smile. But Darian, I don't think that's what will happen. How can you be so certain? She was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the swirling lights in the alien sky. Because I've felt your heart, she said finally, through our limited connection. I've touched the core of who you are. You're kind, even when kindness is difficult. You're brave, even when you're terrified. You carry others' pain as if it were your own, and you've never stopped hoping for something better. Her words created an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with physical pain. You see me more clearly than I see myself. That's what love does, she said softly, then seemed surprised by her own words. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. But as the night deepened and the aurora continued its ancient dance, Darian realized that somewhere in the past week, something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer thinking of Zerilyn as his alien captor or even as his diplomatic spouse. She had become something more personal, more precious, someone he was beginning to love in return. If we do this, he said quietly, if we complete the bond, what happens to us as individuals? Do we cease to exist as separate people? No, Zerilyn replied, turning to face him with eyes that held depths like stars. We become more ourselves than we ever were alone. The bond doesn't erase individuality, it enhances it. You'll still be Darian Vale, the man who carries his soldiers' memories like sacred trusts. I'll still be Zerilyn of the Fifth House, trying to live up to an impossible legacy, but we'll also be something new together. As she spoke, the crystal walls around them pulsed with gentle light, responding to the emotional resonance building between them. Darian realized that the chamber itself was somehow alive, somehow aware of what was happening within its crystalline embrace. I think, he said slowly, I'm ready to find out what that something new might be. Zerilyn's smile was radiant enough to outshine the aurora. Then tomorrow, if you're still certain, we begin the final phase of the bonding ritual. That night, Darian dreamed of flying through stars with wings made of light, never alone, never afraid, carrying all of his burdens, but somehow finding them lighter for being shared. The Bond Eternality final bonding ritual began at dawn on the 10th day, when the binary stars cast everything in shades of gold and amber. Zerilyn had explained that the process would take most of the day and would be irreversible once begun. There would be no going back to who they had been as separate individuals. Are you certain? She asked one final time as they stood together in the center of their crystal chamber. She had changed into robes of pure white that seemed to capture and reflect the starlight streaming through the windows, while Darian wore simple ceremonial garments that she had somehow produced for him. I'm certain, he replied, and realized that he meant it completely. The past 10 days had shown him possibilities he'd never imagined, not just for himself, but for both their peoples. If their bond could serve as a bridge between species, if it could help prevent future wars, then it was worth any personal risk. But more than that, he wanted this for purely selfish reasons. He wanted to know Zerylin as completely as she would know him. He wanted to share not just words and touches, but the very essence of his being with someone who understood him so deeply. Then we begin, she said, taking his hands in hers. The moment their palms touched, the entire chamber came alive. Crystal walls blazed with light that seemed to originate from within the very atoms of the structure. The floor beneath their feet warmed and began to pulse with a rhythm that matched their heartbeats, first his, then hers, then gradually synchronizing into a single shared tempo. Don't fight what you feel, Zerylin whispered, her voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. Let the bond flow through you, around you, into you. At first, it was like the memory sharing they had experienced before, but magnified 1,000-fold. Darian felt Zerylin's childhood fears, her adolescent dreams, her adult responsibilities pressing down on her like a weight. He experienced her first sight of him, through the diplomatic transmissions, the shock of recognition that had changed her entire universe in an instant. But then the sharing deepened. He began to feel her emotions as if they were his own, her fierce protectiveness toward her people, her desperate hope that this bond might heal centuries of mistrust, her growing love for him that she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. In return, she experienced his memories of war, but also his memories of peace, quiet moments with his military family, the satisfaction of a job well done, the simple pleasure of watching a sunset from the observation deck of a starship. She felt his loneliness, but also his capacity for loyalty, his willingness to sacrifice for others, his deep-seated need to protect those he cared about. As the hours passed, the boundaries between them became increasingly fluid. Darian could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and Zerylin's began. Her fear of inadequacy merged with his imposter syndrome, his grief for fallen comrades intertwined with her sorrow for a brother lost to war. Their individual traumas didn't disappear, but they became shared burdens, somehow easier to carry together than they had been alone. I love you, he said at some point, though he wasn't sure if he spoke the words aloud or if they simply flowed directly from his consciousness to hers. I love you too, came her response, warm and certain, and carrying harmonics that resonated through every crystal in the chamber. The final phase of the bonding was unlike anything either of them had expected. Instead of losing themselves in each other, they found themselves becoming more distinctly individual than they had ever been before. Darian felt his own personality crystallize and solidify, as if seeing himself clearly for the first time through Zerylin's eyes. She experienced the same clarification of self, understanding her own nature more deeply through his perception of her. They were still separate people, but they were also something new, a partnership that transcended the sum of its parts, a connection that spanned not just consciousness but soul. When the bonding was complete, they found themselves lying together on the crystalline floor, exhausted but exhilarated. The chamber around them had returned to its normal gentle luminescence, but somehow everything looked different, more vivid, more alive, as if they were seeing the world through enhanced senses. How do you feel? Zerylin asked, her voice now carrying subtle harmonics that resonated directly with his nervous system. Complete, Darian replied, and realized it was the perfect word. For the first time in his adult life, he felt whole. And you? Like I've been waiting my entire life for this moment without knowing it, she said, sitting up and helping him do the same. As they embraced, the sealed door finally dissolved, revealing the corridor beyond. They could hear voices approaching, royal guards and diplomatic officials who had undoubtedly been waiting anxiously for news. Ready to face the universe as a bonded pair? Zerylin asked with a smile that he felt as much as saw. With you? "I'm ready for anything," Darian replied. Hand in hand, they walked toward the open doorway and the future that awaited them. Behind them, the crystal chamber pulsed once with warm light before falling silent, its purpose fulfilled. In the days that followed, their bond would indeed serve as a bridge between species. Darian's understanding of Thalquari culture, filtered through his complete connection with Zerolin, would help Earth's diplomats navigate complex negotiations with unprecedented success. Her insight into human nature, gained through their shared consciousness, would allow her to advocate for human concerns within the royal court in ways that had never been possible before. But all of that was still to come. For now, they simply walked together into whatever tomorrow might bring. No longer two separate beings struggling to understand each other across the vast gulf of space and species, but one unified consciousness wearing two bodies, ready to write a new chapter in the history of both their peoples. The vacation that had begun as a diplomatic duty had become something far more precious, the foundation of a love that would reshape the galaxy itself.